You're no longer the person who absorbed their chaos to keep the peace. No longer the one who explained yourself into exhaustion, hoping they'd finally understand. No longer available for the fusion that once defined you. And what emerges in the space where participation mystique collapsed isn't a return to who you were before. It's the revelation of who you actually are beneath the entanglement. This isn't about becoming hard, closed, or defended. It's about what Jung documented happens when the empathic person completes differentiation, when they've integrated enough shadow, withdrawn enough psychic energy, and developed enough sovereignty that the old identity no longer fits. You don't become not an empath. You become something Jung observed was far more psychologically powerful. An individuated consciousness that can attune without fusing, feel without absorbing, and exist in your own reality regardless of external chaos. Jung spent decades studying this metamorphosis, the psychological transformation that occurs when participation mystique, the unconscious fusion between self and other, finally collapses. And what he documented contradicts almost everything popular psychology suggests about healed empaths. You don't go back to trusting easily. You don't return to automatic forgiveness. You don't resume the patterns that required you to abandon your center to maintain connection. The collapse of participation mystique is irreversible, and what emerges isn't the person you were before the entanglement. It's the person you were never allowed to become. Most explorations of empathic transformation focus on what you stop doing. Stop absorbing. Stop over-explaining. Stop people-pleasing. But Jung's observation goes deeper. It's not just behavioral change. It's structural reorganization of your entire psychological system. Your capacity for empathy doesn't disappear. It integrates with something it was previously operating without: differentiation. The ability to distinguish your emotional reality from someone else's emotional projection. The capacity to feel deeply without making others' feelings your responsibility. The sovereignty to exist in your own truth even when it's being actively denied by someone else. This integration, empathy plus differentiation, is what creates the psychological position Jung called the individuated self. And this position, once reached, becomes virtually unshakable. Not because you've built walls, but because you've developed center. You can still attune to others' emotional states. You can still offer genuine compassion. You can still connect deeply, but you can no longer be destabilized by projection, guilted into fusion, or gaslit into doubting your own perception. The empathic capacity remains. The participation mystique is gone. And this combination is what makes the post-collapse empath psychologically formidable. Jung observed that this transformation terrifies those still operating from projection and manipulation, not because you've become cruel, but because you've become clear. You can see their shadow material without absorbing it. You can recognize projection without defending against it. You can witness their performance without participating in it. And this clarity, maintained without aggression or withdrawal, reveals something they cannot tolerate: that their entire system was built on your willingness to remain unconscious. When you become conscious, their unconsciousness becomes visible, and visibility is unbearable for structures built on denial. Let's understand what Jung actually documented about this metamorphosis. In his work on individuation, Jung observed that the empathic person, the one with natural capacity for attunement, faces a specific developmental challenge. Their gift for feeling others' emotional states becomes a trap if it's not integrated with psychological boundaries. And for most empathic people, the integration doesn't happen until participation mystique collapses so completely that continuing the old pattern becomes psychologically untenable. You didn't choose to differentiate. Your system forced it. Because the alternative, continuing to absorb chaos, regulate others' emotions, sacrifice your reality to validate theirs, was threatening your psychological survival. Jung called this the wisdom of the psyche, the deeper self recognizing what consciousness couldn't yet admit, that the dynamic was killing something essential in you. And it withdrew your investment automatically, not through willpower but through the organism's natural movement toward survival. This withdrawal, what Jung called the withdrawal of libido, is what initiates the metamorphosis. Your psychic energy, which was flowing outward into fusion with others, returns to yourself. And when that energy returns, it doesn't go back into the old patterns. It reorganizes around a new center, a center that exists independent of others' participation, validation, or understanding. Jung observed this as the birth of genuine self, not the persona you constructed to be acceptable, but the actual psychological core that was always there beneath the performance. Who you become in this reorganization isn't recognizable to those who knew you in fusion, because fusion was the entire relationship. They related to the version of you that absorbed their projections, carried their shadow, regulated their chaos. When you stop performing these functions, there's nothing left for them to relate to. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped being who they needed you to be for their system to function. And this is where Jung's observation becomes critical. The people who experience your transformation as loss, as cruelty, as abandonment, they're revealing what the relationship always was, not genuine connection, but participation mystique. Unconscious fusion where your role was to maintain their stability at the cost of your own. Your differentiation doesn't destroy the relationship. It reveals that genuine relationship was never present. What existed was psychological entanglement, and entanglement cannot survive consciousness. Who you become after this revelation is someone who can no longer participate in unconscious fusion, not because you've decided to be difficult, but because your psychological structure has reorganized at a level deeper than choice. You've integrated what Jung called the knowledge of your own shadow. You've seen the parts of yourself that enabled the dysfunction, the ways you used empathy to avoid confrontation, the ways you absorbed others' chaos to feel needed, the ways you sacrificed boundaries to maintain the illusion of connection. This shadow integration is what prevents you from returning to the old patterns, because you can't unsee your own complicity. You can't unknow that your empathic capacity, when operating without differentiation, was creating the conditions for abuse, not because you deserved it, but because participation mystique requires two people, one projecting, one absorbing, and you were the absorber. Recognizing this doesn't mean blaming yourself. It means seeing the full psychological mechanism, and seeing it completely is what makes unconscious repetition impossible. Jung documented that this level of self-awareness, where you can hold both your genuine empathic gift and your unconscious participation in dysfunction, creates what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox without collapsing into either extreme. You're not hardening into defensive boundaries. You're not returning to naive openness. You're integrating both into something new. Empathy that knows its limits, openness that requires reciprocity, connection that demands differentiation as foundation. This integration is who you're becoming, and it's not comfortable, because it doesn't fit into the categories most people understand. You're not the selfless empath anymore, but you're not the defended narcissist either. You exist in what Jung called the middle ground, psychologically sovereign but still capable of genuine feeling, boundaried but not closed, clear but not cruel. And this position confuses people who are used to extremes, who assume that if you're not absorbing, you must be attacking. If you're not fusing, you must be rejecting. But Jung observed that psychological maturity is precisely this capacity to exist outside binary thinking, to be empathic without being enmeshed, to be sovereign without being isolated, to feel deeply without being destabilized. And the people who cannot understand this integration are revealing their own position on the consciousness spectrum. They're still operating from participation mystique, where relationship means fusion, where boundaries mean rejection, where your differentiation feels like attack because it removes you as carrier for their projections. Who you become after participation mystique collapses isn't someone who's given up on connection. It's someone who's redefined what connection actually means. Not fusion, not unconscious entanglement, but what Jung called conscious relationship, where two differentiated people meet as sovereign beings, neither absorbing the other, neither projecting shadow, neither requiring the other to abandon self to maintain the dynamic. And this type of connection, Jung observed, is incredibly rare, because it requires both people to have done the individuation work, both people to have integrated shadow, both people to have developed genuine self rather than defensive persona. Most people haven't done this work. They're still operating from projection, still dependent on fusion, still requiring someone else to carry what they cannot hold themselves. This is why after participation mystique collapses, your social world often contracts dramatically. Not because you're withdrawing, but because most of your relationships were based on fusion, and fusion cannot continue when one person has differentiated. The relationships that remain, the ones that survive your transformation, are the ones that were operating from genuine connection all along, where your differentiation doesn't threaten them, where your sovereignty doesn't feel like abandonment, where your clarity doesn't register as cruelty. These relationships are rare, but they're real. And Jung observed that one genuine relationship, built on mutual differentiation and conscious connection, is psychologically more nourishing than dozens of fusion-based entanglements. Because genuine relationship doesn't drain you. It doesn't require you to abandon yourself. It doesn't demand constant regulation of others' emotions. It exists in the space between two sovereign beings who choose connection without sacrificing autonomy. Who you're becoming is someone who can only participate in this type of relationship. Not because you're demanding or difficult, but because your psychological structure has reorganized to the point where fusion is no longer possible. You've developed what Jung called psychological immunity to participation mystique. You can feel it approaching. You can recognize the pull toward fusion. And you can choose differently, not from fear, but from genuine preference for consciousness over unconsciousness, for sovereignty over entanglement, for truth over the comfortable lie of fusion. Let's be specific about what this transformation looks like in lived experience. Because Jung's concepts can remain abstract unless we understand how they manifest in actual behavior, actual choices, actual moments of recognition. Who you become after participation mystique collapses shows up in how you respond when someone tries to pull you back into fusion. When they guilt you for having boundaries, when they call your clarity cruelty, when they interpret your calm as coldness. The old you would have absorbed this, would have questioned yourself, would have wondered if maybe they're right, maybe you are being too harsh, maybe you should give them another chance. But the post-collapse you recognize as projection immediately, not intellectually, viscerally. You feel the pull toward fusion. You see the manipulation. You recognize the guilt as their disowned shame being externalized onto you, and you don't absorb it. This isn't because you've become hard. It's because you've become differentiated. Jung documented that differentiation creates what he called psychological transparency to projection. You can see it, you can name it, you can recognize it as not yours. And this recognition, this capacity to observe projection without absorbing it, is what makes you psychologically formidable. Because projection only works when the target doesn't see it. When you see it clearly, it loses all power. Who you've become is someone who sees clearly. And this clarity extends beyond just recognizing others' projections. You see your own shadow material with equal precision. You catch yourself when you're about to slip into old patterns, when you're tempted to over-explain, when you feel the pull to absorb their chaos just to end the discomfort, when you want to sacrifice your boundary to restore the temporary peace that fusion provided. But now you know what that peace costs. And you're no longer willing to pay it. Not because you've become selfish, but because you've integrated Jung's observation that false peace, peace maintained through one person's self-abandonment, isn't actually peace. It's suspended conflict. It's postponed confrontation with reality. It's the illusion of harmony created by one person absorbing all the dissonance. And that absorption was destroying you. Who you're becoming is someone who chooses genuine discomfort over false peace, who can tolerate the tension of unresolved conflict rather than rushing to resolve it through self-sacrifice, who can sit in the space of not being understood rather than explaining yourself into exhaustion trying to make them see. This tolerance for psychological discomfort, this capacity to not immediately soothe, fix, or absorb, is what Jung recognized as psychological maturity. Most people cannot tolerate this discomfort. They need immediate resolution. They need you to absorb their anxiety so they can return to stability. They need you to validate their reality so they don't have to question it. And when you stop providing these functions, they experience it as violence, not because you're doing anything to them, but because your refusal to absorb is forcing them into proximity with their own disowned material. And that proximity is unbearable for those who've never developed capacity to hold their own shadow. Your transformation into someone who can hold discomfort without absorbing it is what makes you threatening to psychological systems built on projection. Because you're no longer available as dumping ground for their disowned material. You're no longer functioning as external regulator for their internal chaos. You're no longer sacrificing your stability to create the illusion of their stability. And when you stop performing these functions, their system destabilizes. Not because of what you're doing, but because of what you've stopped doing. Jung observed that this destabilization in others is often accompanied by escalation. They double down on guilt. They intensify the accusations. They create crisis to force you back into the old pattern. Because crisis always worked before. Crisis always pulled you back into fusion. Crisis always made you abandon your boundaries to provide stability. But who you've become is someone who can witness crisis without absorbing it. Who can observe their escalation without being pulled into reactivity. Who can maintain differentiation even under pressure. This steadiness, this capacity to remain centered while others destabilize around you, is what Jung called psychological sovereignty. And it's not something you learn intellectually. It's something that emerges after participation. Mystique has collapsed so completely that fusion is no longer psychologically possible. You've been through the fire. You've experienced the full cost of absorption. You've felt the near destruction of self that comes from chronic fusion, and your organism has reorganized to prevent that from ever happening again. Who you've become is someone whose psychological immune system now recognizes fusion as threat. Not consciously, automatically. You feel it in your body before your mind catches up. The tightness in your chest when someone's trying to guilt you. The exhaustion that floods in when you're in the presence of someone who needs you to regulate them. The visceral no that arises when someone asks you to abandon your boundary. Jung would recognize this as the body's wisdom, the somatic knowledge that integration brings. You don't have to think about whether to maintain boundaries. Your system maintains them automatically because it's learned at a cellular level what fusion costs. This embodied differentiation is what makes the transformation irreversible. Because it's not just psychological insight, it's physiological reorganization. Your nervous system has changed. Your stress responses have recalibrated. Your tolerance for fusion-based dynamics has dropped to zero not through willpower, but through organic adaptation. You literally cannot go back because your body won't let you. And this somatic boundary is the most reliable one, because it can't be talked around, guilted through, or rationalized away. Who you're becoming is someone whose entire organism, mind, emotion, body, has aligned around sovereignty. And this alignment is what creates the unshakable quality Jung observed in individuated people. They're not defended. They're not performing strength. They're not forcing boundaries through aggression. They're simply no longer available for fusion. And this unavailability isn't rejection of connection. It's requirement of consciousness as foundation for connection. They can still love deeply. They just can't fuse unconsciously. And this distinction is everything. Let me be specific about how this manifests in the type of connection you can now engage with versus what you can no longer tolerate. Because the transformation isn't about becoming incapable of relationship, it's about becoming incapable of unconscious relationship. And there's a vast difference. Who you've become can connect more deeply than before. But only with people who've also done the differentiation work. Only with people who don't need you to abandon yourself to make them feel stable. Only with people who can meet you as sovereign being rather than as extension of themselves. This type of connection, what Jung called conscious relationship, requires both people to show up differentiated, both people to have integrated their shadow, both people to be capable of holding their own emotional reality without requiring the other to regulate it. And when this type of connection exists, it's psychologically profound. Because you're not performing for each other. You're not managing each other's emotions. You're not walking on eggshells to avoid destabilizing the other person. You're simply present, authentic, real. And that realness creates intimacy that fusion could never provide. But most people you encounter haven't done this work. They're still operating from persona, still projecting shadow, still dependent on fusion for any sense of stability. And who you've become can see this immediately. You can feel the difference between someone who's differentiated and someone who's still enmeshed. You can sense within minutes whether someone's capable of conscious relationship or whether they're looking for someone to fuse with. And this discernment, this capacity to assess psychological structure accurately, is part of the transformation. You're no longer giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. You're no longer assuming that if you just explain yourself clearly enough, they'll understand. You're no longer hoping that your empathy will inspire them to develop consciousness. You've integrated what Jung called the hard truth of psychological reality, that consciousness cannot be given to someone who's committed to remaining unconscious. That differentiation cannot be inspired in someone whose entire identity depends on fusion. That genuine self cannot be developed in someone who's built their entire life on persona. This integration of hard truth is what others often interpret as cynicism. They see you're no longer naively hopeful, no longer automatically trusting, no longer willing to give endless chances. And they call this hardness, bitterness, closing off. But Jung would recognize it as realism, as psychological maturity, as the natural consequence of having seen clearly how unconscious dynamics operate and refusing to participate in them anymore. Who you've become isn't bitter. You're boundaried. You're not closed. You're discerning. You're not hard. You're honest. And honesty, genuine psychological honesty, is often uncomfortable for people still invested in illusion. Because your honesty reveals what they're avoiding. Your boundaries expose what they've been getting away with. Your differentiation makes their fusion visible as the dysfunction it always was. Jung observed that individuated people often experience social isolation, not because they're rejecting others, but because their consciousness is incompatible with most people's unconsciousness. The gap is too wide. The individuated person can see dynamics the unconscious person is still completely identified with. And this gap makes genuine communication impossible. You're speaking from differentiated consciousness. They're speaking from participation mystique. You might use the same words, but you mean entirely different things. And this fundamental incompatibility of psychological position is what creates the isolation. But Jung also observed that this isolation is temporary, because as you stabilize in your differentiation, you begin to magnetize others who've done similar work, who've also collapsed out of participation mystique, who've also integrated shadow, who've also developed genuine self. These people recognize you instantly because differentiated people can sense each other. There's a quality of presence, a capacity for directness, a comfort with silence, a lack of performance. And when you meet someone operating from this same place, connection happens naturally, without effort, without fusion, just genuine meeting between two sovereign beings. These connections are what make the transformation worth it, because one relationship built on mutual differentiation is more psychologically nourishing than 100 relationships built on fusion. You're not drained afterward. You're not wondering what they really meant. You're not analyzing whether you said the right thing. You're not managing their emotions or absorbing their projections. You're simply present with someone who's also present. And that presence, that capacity to be fully yourself without performance, is what Jung called genuine relationship. Who you're becoming is someone who can only engage in genuine relationship, who can no longer participate in the performance, who can no longer absorb to keep peace, who can no longer fuse to create the illusion of connection. This isn't limitation, it's liberation. Because the energy you used to spend on managing unconscious dynamics is now available for genuine living, for creating, for being present to your actual life rather than constantly regulating everyone else's emotional reality. Jung documented that this reclamation of psychic energy is one of the most dramatic aspects of the transformation. People often report feeling more alive, more creative, more present than they've ever felt. Not because anything external has changed, but because the energy that was chronically flowing outward into fusion has returned to self. And with that energy comes vitality, clarity, presence, the capacity to actually live your life rather than being chronically absorbed in managing others' lives. Who you've become is someone in possession of your own energy, and this possession is what creates the sovereignty others find so threatening. Because sovereign people cannot be controlled through guilt, manipulated through projection, or destabilized through chaos. They exist in their own reality. They trust their own perception. They know what's true regardless of whether anyone else sees it. And this self-possession, this psychological independence is what Jung recognized as the goal of individuation. You haven't become someone who doesn't care. You become someone who cares differently, who can feel deeply without being destroyed by what you feel, who can attune to others without losing yourself in them, who can offer genuine compassion without sacrificing your own stability to provide theirs. This integration of empathy and sovereignty is what makes you psychologically complete. Not perfect, not finished with growth, but no longer dependent on external validation, fusion, or participation mystique to know who you are. And who you are after participation mystique collapses is someone Jung would recognize as individuated. Not fully. Individuation is lifelong. But you've crossed the threshold. You've differentiated from collective unconsciousness. You've integrated enough shadow that projection no longer controls you. You've developed enough sovereignty that fusion no longer tempts you. And you've discovered that genuine self that was always there beneath the performance, the absorption, the chronic sacrifice of center, to maintain connection with those who could only relate through fusion. This self, your actual self, is who you're becoming, not who you wish you were, not who others needed you to be, but who you actually are when you're not performing, absorbing, or fusing. And this self, Jung observed, is the only foundation for genuine life. Everything built on persona, on performance, on fusion, it's temporary. It collapses eventually. But what's built on genuine self endures. Because it's real, it's true, it's you. Who the empath becomes after participation, Mystique collapses is someone real, someone true, someone sovereign, someone who can finally live their actual life rather than the life that fusion demanded. And this life, though it looks nothing like what you expected, is what Jung called the life worth living. Not because it's easy, Not because everyone understands, but because it's yours. Finally, completely irreversibly yours. This is who you're becoming, and there's no going back. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark.